Come on, demons. Come on, demons. Come on, demons. Come on, come on, come on, come on, demons. I've got this feeling.
Good evening, Demon fans, and welcome back to the Demonland podcast. My name is Andy, and it's been 635 days since the D's last lost 2 games in a row. Incidentally, those 2 defeats were also against the Dockers and the Swans, and we all know what happened as a result of those losses. Joining me tonight to discuss our latest defeat is Demonland veteran George. Good evening, George.
Good evening, Andy. Good evening, Binland. Good evening, Demon listeners. Yes, 2 successive losses. Have the wheels fallen off, or is it something else at play? We'll hopefully find out, but just a warning to the listeners, this could be a long night, given that we might have had to put a new server on at Demonland to cope with the interest this week.
Well, it'll either be a long night or very quick. So I've got a very bad headache, and I think it's as a result of the 2 losses. I don't know how to deal with myself. Also joining us tonight, a man that can hopefully talk me off the ledge and convince me that the sky is not falling. Bin Man, good evening, Bin Man.
Good evening, Andy. Good evening, George. Good evening, Demonlanders. And tonight, actually, all we're going to do is replay the episode, the Demonland podcast from this very point in time last season, and that's all we'll need to do because we're about to discuss pretty much the same things. So, history does repeat. Despite the AFL mantra, it seems that we have a collective amnesia and all our memories are reset come round 1 every year, and we forget everything that we've sort of landed on in previous years, but I'll touch on that a bit later.
What were we last year at this time? We won our first 9, then we lost 1, so that was 9-1.
Beaten by the Crows, then we regathered ourselves and beat the Dogs. Round 12 in this game, we started slowly, 22 points down against Lions, if I recall correctly. Looked a bit flat. And then came out and attacked in that second half and got over the top. And then the very next week, we got beaten by Collingwood.
So we were looking a lot better last year because, one, we had a better win-loss record, but we had just knocked off 2 big contenders. We've just lost now to 1 very big contender and 1 sort of middle of the top 8.
Well, if you recall, though, there was lots of people jumping up and down after the Adelaide loss and even before that. And, we had 2 good wins in a row. But, it's similar.
I would have preferred to have lost to West Coast or North and then beaten both Fremantle and Swans.
No, you wouldn't have.
No, definitely not.
All right, maybe not. But I did see today on Twitter that the Tigers in 2019 lost 3 games in a row and were 7-6 after round 13. Eagles in 2018 were 10-1 and then lost 3 games in a row. Tigers in 2017 lost 3 games in a row and were 7-5 after round 13. So all is...
You cut my lunch there, Andy.
Oh, sorry. All right, everyone, forget that.
But those facts are true. Those facts are true. The big question is why. Why did that happen at the midpoint of those seasons?
All right, so we will find out all of that later, but I will give a bit of a summary of the match in case you were elsewhere. My night didn't start off right with the news that Tom McDonald was to be replaced in the side by Mitch Brown due to, at the time, an unspecified foot injury. I don't think we even know. We know it's a list, Frank, but we don't know how much time, but it's probably for the rest of the season. The news, in fact, had been leaked a few days before on Demonland, but that was just an unsubstantiated rumour at the time, and it's turned out to be 100% accurate. So for everyone who's keeping scores, I think it was T. Davis on Demonland. He's got the good mail. So we talked last week about the importance of Tom McDonald's strength in the contest in the forward line. This strength is crucial to the blocking he provides, not to mention his own strong marking and scoring capabilities. With confirmation that T-Mac will probably now be out for the rest of the season with that injury, it's likely that we won't see him again, and that absence in the forward line, has certainly been felt. It was felt on the weekend, and we'll talk more about our forward line woes in a little bit later. It's absolutely clear that we are a different side without the general in Stephen May down back. Tomlinson, he's not really an adequate replacement to what we get out of May. And I was almost despondent when Petty went down for a second week in a row. He did, however, return. He showed his class when he came back on. Clearly hampered, though, by the shoulder injury, but he was still able to produce some great contested marks and spoils. So let's hope there's nothing more serious there. Whilst it was encouraging to have some of the cavalry return from injury this week, none of them were able to have the same impact that we have come to expect from them. Salem, for all his polish, just seemed a little bit off, which is to be expected given his 10 or 11 weeks on the sidelines. Ed Langdon's run and endurance on the wing just wasn't as damaging as it's been, and perhaps he too is still hampered by his broken ribs. And Harms as well failed to impact the contest, bar a cameo here and there. Our first quarter was blistering, and it's what we've come to expect from the Ds as we piled on 5-1. Yet a worrying aspect of the last few weeks is that we get out to these early leads only to allow our opposition to get back into the match and overrun us in the end. And no longer can we just rely on our superior fitness. And I'm wondering if that superior fitness is still there, or if it's the injuries that many players are carrying, or if it's the loading, which we're going to talk about later, are having an effect on the outcomes of these matches. After blowing our lead in the second quarter, we were able to get the match back on our terms in the third, but then the dreaded inaccuracy came home to roost after an accurate first half, and we wasted a number of opportunities, kicking 1-5 for the quarter. In the past 2 weeks, guys, our last halves have been costly. 1-5 and 1-1 in the last 2 quarters of this match, and last week it was 1-2 and 0-4. And that's 3 goals, 12 behinds to 16 goals, 9 in the last half over the last 2 weeks. That's 105 to 30 over 2 weeks in the second half, a 75-point deficit over those 2 weeks. And surely this is a bit of a worrying sign. And I'll talk more about our lack of connection with our forward line later when we go into our tactical talk. Needless to say, bombing it high and long into our forward line is not working. Thankfully, Max and Fritsch were able to contribute 6 goals between them, but the Browns did fail to score any goals, and neither did our small forward brigade. Max Gawn was simply outstanding with 28 disposals and a PB of 23 contested possessions, 30 hit-outs and 11 to advantage, 10 score involvements, 9 marks, 6 of them contested, 5 clearances and 3 goals. He really was my only highlight of the night. So where to from here? It's clear that this side is not firing on all cylinders. It was fantastic to bank all those wins early on, but I don't buy that we weren't going at weren't getting out of second gear for most of the season. I think second gear was enough to win those matches against oppositions that were performing poorly. But these past 2 weeks were the weeks to show where we were truly at, and I'll concede that injuries and structures hampered us against the Dockers, and injuries may have had a hand in the loss, but there are some other worrying signs, and we'll get stuck into those as the show goes on. Guys, do you have any general comments you want to make about the match, George? I'll start with you.
Really nothing. I think we'll cover it all off in the various things that we're going to talk about tonight, but there is absolutely no doubt that we are not kicking enough goals at the moment, and hopefully we can find a few reasons tonight.
Look, I mean, again, I'll touch on it a bit later, but I think the one of the critical things that the D's fans really need to understand about how we play as it relates to our offense is that our defensive system is at the heart of the 3 phases of football that Goody has talked about ever since he's been at the club. They're all interconnected, and our offensive system is completely reliant on our defensive system to work. And our defensive system is built on 2 things. In fact, our whole game plan is built on 2 things. Number 1 is contested ball. Now, all clubs are contested ball. There's no club in the AFL who doesn't prioritise contested ball anymore. That's the standard footy. spread on our defense is all based on our ability to cover the ground and gut run, and not just one player doing it, not just two players doing it, not just two or three like back in 2019 when it was Nibbler doing that sort of running. 22 players, 4 on the bench and the 8 on the field, all doing that sort of running. And if we're not able to, or we're not doing that running for whatever reason, whether it be injury or whatever the cause is simply we won't score. And so critique of the forward line has to be considered in the context of the way we score. And when we score, we swarm. We move the ball. When we press go, we move the ball in waves. We've talked about this through the season and in previous seasons. 2 or 3 players running either side of the ball carrier. We absolutely swarm opposition and we get it forward, which means that often we're kicking to a forward line where we've got 2 or 3 free players because we're pressed forward and beat them on the rebound. You only need to look at the key stat to tell us what's going on where our defensive running's not at. We didn't score a single point from a turnover this game. I mean,
I believe we scored 5 points.
Single goal from turnover, and they scored 7, I understand. And that is all about the defensive running. And so you're going to have a forward line that looks, when you strip away our ability to create fast breaks into our forward line that create those free players, that happens all the time when we're on. If you strip that away, what you're left with is talls who multiple ones go up in the pack, and it frustrates everyone to no end. Kicking into the pocket suddenly looks disastrous. It looks like hard work, and that's how it's looked for the last couple of weeks. But there was one stat, I can't remember, Andy, sorry if you mentioned it, but that I think is really important in the context of this game is that we had 150 contested possessions to 136. It wasn't for lack of physical effort. If we were being complacent and we were dropping off and our heads weren't in the game, then there's no way we wouldn't have 14 more contested possessions, and a team that everyone was talking about how fantastic the pressure was from the Swans, but we had 12 more contested possessions than them. That speaks to me of a team that is got its head in the game and is right on. But what's clear, you just have to watch what's happening. Just have to watch them at the ground. Is we're not spreading as hard. We're simply not. Max Gawn was sucking wind 10 minutes into that first quarter. We're clearly fatigued, and it reminded me just of the last game that I saw last year at the Giants game. It was so evident that we were fatigued in that game. It was never more evident, and that's what it looks like to me at the moment. So I think that. That all power to the Swans. They played terrific, but I reckon that contested possession is it's a really good indicator that people shouldn't be too concerned, particularly about the sort of fear that maybe we've got complacent or our game's in good shape. Those numbers all looked pretty solid. We had 65 turnovers, both teams. Uncontested possessions, we had 35 more than them. We had. The possession was pretty level. The numbers were pretty similar. And I would argue that once you take away our weapon, which is our defensive spread and what we get from it, we then we come back to the pack and we look like the Swans, and that's our level. But it won't be our level come finals when we've got our defensive running up and going again.
Well, I'll talk more a bit later about scores from turnovers because that's one of my improvements to talk about later, because we've been very well down, and when I roll off some of these stats, you'll see just how down we are. Well, let's get into our tactics talk. George, tonight you want to talk about the resting ruck and the forward line structure, so take it away.
Yeah, it's just something that I noticed particularly in this game, but I've been keeping an eye on the last couple of games as well. And so it's more about a question I've got about whether we're getting full benefit out of the way that we're utilising our rucks and the resting. We're obviously resting the ruck in the forward line. So what I observed was that the resting ruck goes to the traditional full forward role. My questions are, this is then used as part of the rotations. So once Max, for example, goes to the full forward position, he displaces Ben Brown or he displaces Mitch Brown in this game. So we're lacking a full forward suddenly. We've got a replacement full forward sitting there. Either Max or Jacko are not leading full forwards. They're ruckmen. And then while they're good there to get a mark, and that was quite successfully utilised by Max in this game, it wasn't by Jackson. So my question is, are we actually inhibiting ourselves in our forwards by firstly running one less forward and then replacing him with someone who's not a forward in the first place? The second question, of course, is are we actually getting a rest into our ruckman by doing this? It's been a successful exercise for us for the last 2 years because, if you'll recall, very, very few teams ran two proper ruckmen until we started doing it a couple of years ago. Has the advantage disappeared now? Most teams seem to be running the double ruckman. But my question is about, are we actually inhibiting the leading patterns of the genuine forwards that we've got by putting a ruckman in there? Are we inhibiting our chances of getting goals by actually taking one of the forwards out as part of the rotations? So it's just a question I'd like to ask.
Big man, what do you think?
I think it's hard to tell at the moment. There's a few things going on in that space, I reckon, one of which is that they're clearly giving Jackson more time in the ruck. There's been talk about whether Maxie's carrying a bit of a niggle, but I mean, he was phenomenal on the weekend. That was one of the most incredible games of footy. I mean, he's played some incredible games of footy in the last couple of years, and that was right up there of his personal best. So that's definitely a factor. And on that, I've been a bit surprised actually that Maxie hasn't gone back more to shore up our defence, particularly when May's been out of the team in the last couple of weeks. So that is interesting. I wonder I think it's an interesting question in terms of when you have someone who's not in that forward line as a standard thing for everyone's patterns around it, I guess, not just the leading one. But, I mean, it's been interesting, hasn't it, George? Maxie's not just been in the forward line. He's playing super deep. He's playing out of the goal square, which is Ben Brown's sort of starting spot normally. So you're right.
That's exactly my question, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of bound to cause a bit of discombobulation for Ben Brown, I reckon. Seems to me there's a few things that Goody's been sort of experimenting with this year, and that's one of them. Gus on the halfback flank is another one that's sort of really interesting. I fully expected Salem to come back in. Maybe it was because Rivers went out and Brayshaw to be moved back to the wing, but like that's been an experiment that was born out of necessity, but they've stuck with it. And so there's a couple of other things like Jackson's minutes in the ruck and, Hunt playing as a small defender on smalls. There's been two or three, but yeah, it's an interesting one. And I wonder whether, part of it, George, might be that how much better, bar that terrible miss from Maxie from the snap, but how much more accurate Maxie is now kicking for goal. So he's a legitimate marking threat. But yeah, it's an interesting query. I'll have to sort of watch it a little bit. It does feel a little bit like Goody's experimenting a little bit. And, remember last year there was that whole narrative about what's our best forward line look like? Can we even go with 3-12s? Can we play with T-Mac? All of that stuff was bubbling away all season, all through this point, and it wasn't till 3/4 of the way through the season that we landed on what was ultimately probably always, in my opinion, going to be the setup. And I wonder whether what you're talking about is in the similar space, is not wanting as much as, I take your point that maybe it's hard for us to get to work things out around it, but maybe it's also harder for the opposition to get a read on it if we end up with a slightly different model come finals times. The opposition haven't had quite the time to work out what our patterns are and ways to sort of combat it. But yeah, it's certainly an interesting one. I mean, I really do like the way Maxie, how much more accurate he is, and I really like what he's done with his technique, because he just comes in off one or two steps now and trusts sort of kicking through the ball. He's gone from someone you wouldn't put $10 on from 25 metres out to not quite your home, but not far off it. So, yeah, it's an interesting question.
There's sort of another follow-on from that is if you're a mid coming into the forward line, you see Max standing in front of the goal square, does that cause you to kick to the top of the square?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's
And the complaints from the outer about, why are we keep kicking it long? Is it because Max is actually there? I would.
Yeah. Well, we kick long. That's it's like, again, let's get used to it, these fans. We kick long. And what is different, you're right, though, is that when he's there, they kick to the top of the square more often, which is risky if he doesn't mark it for reasons we've talked about, because then if the opposition get the ground ball, it's in the central corridor. They've got three options to exit our D50. They've got the central corridor and left and right channels. So whereas it's in the pocket, they've got one, or it goes over the boundary line for a throw in. So he's clunking them, though, isn't he? And I like him up forward, but I found it a bit curious he hasn't played more back.
There were also a number of times where we did kick it long into the forward line directly to one of their tall defenders who was unmarked. So we kicked it straight to them. And if we do that again this week, I would imagine Moore and Howe are just going to pick those off fairly easily. So I don't know. Sometimes we might need to do something a little bit different. And I know you say get used to it, but I don't want to get used to opposition defenders just marking it unopposed.
I think an interesting thing about what I was saying before, in terms of you take away our defensive spread, it has a complete domino effect on every other part of our game. But what's interesting about the way Goody coaches is that he doesn't adjust the game plan. So we still kick long, even though the opposition are marking it in our back half, which they never do normally. They're still sticking with the system. And the most evident one of that is it happened again on the weekend, is that Swans brought one, sometimes two extras to the stoppage to dominate or have to do their one. I can't recall them bringing two, but and we didn't match them. And the same went Freo. Freo will bring two to the bouncers, and did against Lions too. And Lions matched them. And we didn't. We stuck with our system despite the fact that they were generating their scores from stoppages, Freo. So I find that really interesting, because he doesn't, even when all of the parts of our game plan aren't working, and in this case I think it's the defensive spread that's causing the problems for us. I mean, you can tell the opposition are moving the ball so much more easily than when we're on and through the corridor and fast, but we're not making an adjustment that might mitigate against that. He's letting for instance, putting Max back in the defensive zone. It's a bit like we're staying with their plan, fellas. Work around it, and we'll work through this. Those it was a disappointing result. I wasn't surprised we lost for the reason I flagged a couple of weeks ago, that I thought we'd struggle in this period. Having said that, I think that we arguably should have won the game in the end. We had that game we had the rhythm of the tempo of the game controlled, it seemed like. But that's, again, we're not doing that in the last a couple of weeks. We're not controlling the tempo. Freo did a brilliant job of controlling it, and so did the Swans, I thought.
From our podcast thread, we've got 2 points from Nairobi Demon. This is Nairobi Demon. 2 points on Goody's press conference stuck out for me. One, he emphasised our forward method as much as forward personnel performance. There were also some interesting observations in the Demonland post-game chat about our forward entry quality depending on where the offensive push begins, e.g. fullback versus halfback / centre, etc. While I'm sure personal performance will receive some attention, I'd be curious to hear the panel's thoughts on forward method. 2, I was struck by how frank Goodwin was about Mitch Brown playing better forward than Wiedemann. He's normally more encouraging, let's say, but it did make me wonder whether he's lost patience with Wiedemann. Curious what you thought of Mitch Brown's game and whether he's clearly playing better football than Weed, or whether he's more marginal. I want to take on Mitch Brown and Weed.
I'll take the first part. Maybe, yep. George, you want to take the Wiedemann Brown part? The first part is just really what I was saying then, is that the forward method isn't about the forwards. like our way of scoring is generated through our swarm, our all defensive run and moving it in numbers down the field along the boundary line often, where we swarm in numbers and often ended up with spares inside 50. And when that happens, when we move the ball quickly, we also generate one-on-ones for our forwards. Just as the Swans and Freo did against us, they were able to generate all of those one-on-ones, and we got crucified in the air both times because both teams moved the ball super quickly and were able to generate it. The Hawthorn did the same when they moved it quickly. When you move the ball quickly, of course, you're more likely to prevent the opposition getting back and creating a good zone in your back half. And so just by a function of that, you're going to have more one-on-ones. So when we're on, we get those one-on-ones and the forward method looks better. When we're not on defensively, we end up with a crowded back line. Opposition can flood back. Both teams, defensively, the Swans were much better than I expected them to be. I was super impressed with their defence. Their tackling numbers were off the charts. I think they had 15 more tackles than us. Freo were even better. They moved the ball quick, but their defence, they were as good as ours. As they moved back, they got back, they clag up that forward line. The way to break that is quick ball movement, and then suddenly our forward method looks a lot better. I think the other thing with method is that we've had Tommy Mack out for the last couple of games. That creates problems. George's point's probably a good sort of one in that space as well, around what Gawn's been playing a lot more forward. I think that I was actually reflecting on this on the weekend. The player that forward / ruckman that I've got, probably the biggest question mark over. Everyone's talking about Brown, which is fair enough because he's had pretty average few weeks. But Jackson's forward craft doesn't blow me away, and I wonder whether that's something that he could work on. He's often up on the half forward flank and he sort of uses his leap, but for a player who's played a fair bit of forward, he doesn't seem like a natural forward. I don't know what you think about that, George.
Yeah, I'd have to agree there. I think he needs more body strength at the moment. And it's easy to forget that he's 20 years of age or something like that. He's in the same position as probably Van Rooyen is. You can see the capabilities there, but still a long way to go from that perspective. And look, in all honesty, in this game, Sydney have got big-bodied backs. When you look at the McCartans and Rampy and Lloyd, they're all big bodies, and it's not surprising that more lightly framed people really suffer in those sort of environments. So, but
they use their bodies well. That's the thing. Probably my knock on Jackson, one-on-one, is that speaking of Weed, is he's like Weed. He doesn't have the ability that, say, Fritter does, who's skinny, to use his body and keep the player either under the ball or away from the drop zone. And Jackson seems to be like a basketball. That's how he looks like. He's always coming up for a tip-off. But the McCartan, they were both terrific, weren't they? And so not only are they strong, they're classic footballers who use their body and hold off the opposition like a player like Hawkins does. Maybe it's a bit rough to be knocking Jackson, but in terms of that forward craft, it's going to be super fascinating because without T-Mac, it goes to that question, I don't know what you thought, Andy and George, about those comments, but they were unusually direct from Goody about Weed, weren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just as I said pre-show, I think just picking Mitch Brown, who's sort of the in case of emergency break glass type of player, and I like Mitch Brown. I've been a fan of everything I've seen up to date of him, but playing Mitch Brown before Wiedemann is a huge statement. And I don't know what was talked about to Wiedemann about why he wasn't getting a game, but those comments by Goody is a fair indication of what what did he say? He said
he's playing better footy than him.
No, about playing big boy. He needs to play big boy football. That's how it sounded. I reckon he didn't quite say it. That's how actually what he meant, but it was trying not to say, if that makes sense. But that's how it came across, is he's got to play like a man who's playing against other men, and that's, I guess, what we've been talking about. If nothing else, it says to me that there's been a change in approach of how to try and get the best way to get the best out of Wiedemann. And this talk about, which I've been part of as well, he's a confidence player. It just struck me as I think that Goodwin's patience on that front is just about run its course.
I'll go back to the original comment about Brown playing the better football, and I think that is correct.
Yeah.
If you look at the Brown the previous week against Frankston,
and Mitch Brown, you're talking
Mitch
about.
Brown, yeah. He was working really hard up the ground, up to the wing. He was the target for Tomlinson in the kickouts, and he. Unlike Wiedemann, unfortunately for Weed, if there's any body contact, he just doesn't mark the ball. He kicked 3 goals this week against Casey, all of which were from uncontested marks. Even when he kicked 6 against North Melbourne, he was credited with 1 contested mark, but in fact, there was no body contact in that situation. It was in a pack, but he was at the back of the pack. If there's the body contact, he just gets pushed off it so easily. And unfortunately, when you're playing against, as we just spoke about, a team like Sydney that's got big bodies, they will push you. And the results are apparently becoming a little bit more broadly known at the moment.
And the bottom line is the number one job these days is not to mark it up forward, that's fantastic if you can. Yep. It's to bring the ball to ground. Yep. And the last 2 weeks has been a disaster for us in our inability to stop the opposition taking contested and uncontested marks for that matter.
And which player has not been in the team?
Yeah, well,
T-Mac.
Exactly.
He won't be and will not be in the team for the majority of the year.
And look, to be honest, that's what I was saying last week about injury. It's the biggest factor in football, and that is a big out. He's not easily replaced, as we can see. We've already gone past the second player, it would seem. I wonder whether they're trying to get his head. It's one last chance saloon for Weed. Who knows? I don't know whether he can take that opportunity. But, Mitch Brown, I rate him. It's a bit like George was saying about when T-Mac went back to Casey. He's a natural footballer who runs to the right spot, but he was behind Wiedemann, and not a huge rap on Wiedemann. So where that leaves us for that second tall, Van Ruin's not ready.
Well, I was going to say Van Ruin. I like the fact that we have the luxury of playing him in the twos, let him develop in the twos, and bring him in when he's ready. But do you think we'll say, hey, let's just try him?
I don't think. Well, only if they think he's ready, because it's no good for his development. That's like you got to. So no is, but maybe no, not now, but maybe closer to the finals. I mean, it's happened in years past, hasn't it? It happened.
Oh, what a bloke named Bowie, yeah.
Yeah, but it's a bit different, isn't it? Like Bowie's side isn't an issue. I mean, the other player I thought, what about Tomlinson going forward? He played centre half forward pretty much a whole season, I think, in 2017 for the Crows. For the Giants, kicked 12 goals that year. He's strong enough to compete up forward. He's got the sort of probably doesn't. It doesn't fill me with super confidence him up forward, but he is strong, isn't he?
We don't know what he's going to actually provide, though. We need that bustling person who's prepared to do the bullocking that T-Mac does so well.
Yeah, exactly. But Brown's not really that sort of player either. He's really on the lead type player as well, and he's not particularly strong. So, yeah.
The other thing Tomlinson might add is that he can be swung back if needed, if someone goes down.
Yeah, well, exactly. So that's right. He's got a bit of flexibility. He's like a poor man's T-Mac.
Yes. All right, let's move on to our positives. I really didn't have a positive from this week's match. I spoke about Max's Herculean efforts. He was simply outstanding. Other than that, my only positives are that the bye is coming, and maybe not soon enough. And the other one is that Stephen May is back this week. We're an infinitely better team with him in the side. However, I'm not positive that Petty is going to get back up after 2 weeks of being banged about. Let's hope there's no shoulder injuries. We haven't heard anything from the injury things we usually hear on Monday. I really hope there's not a, what do we call it, George, Whispering Jack always says, mystery injury of the week, and I hope that's not one of them. just some stats about May that I saw today. The Demons. This was from zerohanger.com. The Demons' latest defeat saw Simon Goodwin's backline structure concede 10 marks inside their defensive 50, the club's second worst tally of the season and highest since round 3. Melbourne's backline also lost 8 defensive one-on-one contests for the match, a metric May has allowed on just 2 occasions from a total of 39 contests. The 5.1% contested defensive loss rate places May number 1 in the competition for one-on-one defensive efforts. It's 4% lower than the next best in the league, Port Adelaide's Tom Jonas. So just that, his contested ball work one-on-one is fantastic. We need him back. We're a much better team with him in it, and not to mention the marshalling that he does as a leader in defence. So he's my positive that he's coming back this week.
Hasn't it been interesting, the critique on Lever in the last little bit? It's, May's been incredible, but it's as if, there's been quite a lot of negative commentary about Lever in the last little bit. I don't know, sorry if you saw First Crack, but they showed like a blooper reel of all these mistakes in the Swans game. But, I guess for me, that's the thing that, again, it's like George was talking about last week with structures, or the week before, May out creates a problem for Lever. And he's less able to do what he's best at with May out of the time.
Well, exactly.
When you got Petty off for a quarter of a game.
But I don't expect Lever to be a one-on-one defensive player. He plays his best footy when we've got May and we've got Petty there doing their work, and Lever coming in to spoil or take that intercept mark.
And he still looks a little off, doesn't he, fitness-wise? Yeah. Like he hasn't ever seemed to look...
He's not the only one. We've got a few that aren't looking NQR. George, you seem to have struggled to come up with a positive for this week's match, and I won't spoil it.
My positive is just leading on from what we're actually talking about. I think it's time to put away the razor blades about what's been happening in the last couple of weeks. Honestly, folks, just have a look at what was missing last week and the half-baked side, effectively, that we're able to put on the field this week. We didn't have Stephen May. We've talked about how critical he is to the system. Petty was out for virtually a whole quarter in this game, in which the Swans kicked 4 goals while he was off the ground. Unsurprisingly, but he wasn't there. That's when the weaknesses fall. Ed Langdon is... you do not recover from broken ribs in the space of 2 weeks. They're still not quite right. You don't expect him to be running as hard, and you don't expect him to be taking the hits that he would have otherwise have done. Harms has just come back and probably filled his roles adequately, but he just wasn't as tough and as hard as what we've learned to expect. But even Petrarca has been down. The 2 Browns were all down this week. And we lost by 2 goals. 2 goals that could have been... Max missed that virtual sitter in the forward line, and Fritsch kicked one out of bounds that normally you would have put on as a certainty down in the book as well. So, and
Ben Brown didn't even make the distance for one of them from 40 out. But we certainly had our chance even in that last quarter, in the last dying minutes, to actually at least get back to a drawn game. We ran out of legs at the end. The Swans kicked 4 goals in that last quarter, and as Andy mentioned before, we kicked 1 for the whole half. And we still only lost by 2 goals. So put the razor blades away. Do you think we're suffering from the Darren Burgess non-effect of not being there this year? I know we've got some injuries and players, but I don't know.
But we're not getting the hamstring injuries. The ones that we're suffering are Liz Franks and contact and concussions and even COVIDs and things like that. It's when you get a whole series of hamstrings, there's something wrong with the conditioning and fitness people. But I don't think that's the situation so far. It's just good old bad luck. And as Binderman said, injuries are critical to a side. about this. And as Goodwin keeps bringing up, this is a tough game. It is a competitive game, and the difference between winning and losing is very little.
Bin Man, we might go to your your positive was also your negative. You want to talk about loading, but we might go to that when we talk about improvements. So we'll get into improvements now. I was going to talk about our forward connection or lack thereof, but I think we've adequately discussed that in the tactics talk section. I think that the other thing I want to talk about, I think our inability over the past 2 weeks to score from intercepts really needs improvements. We've sort of touched on this, but last week we were outscored by 35 points against the Dockers on the turnover, which was our worst differential from our last 36 games. And this week against the Swans, we were outscored on the intercept by 50 points. In fact, we only scored 5 points from intercepts, which further highlights our inaccuracy woes, because if you kick 5 goals instead of the 5 points, you really, sort of create a smaller differential from 50 points to 20 points, and that ends up being the difference between winning and losing. But you were talking about it, our scoring from intercepts, and it's been a problem the last 2 weeks. So hopefully we can find that. And I think our disposal, and might have been down to the pressure that they were applying. You mentioned how much pressure there was, but I thought our disposal, particularly handball, we weren't hitting targets. It was woeful. So needs improvement.
And again, it's the symptom, right? So that's a symptom of something. And the trick is to accurately work out what the cause is. So many of the things that we saw in that game and against Freo are sheeted home to what's clearly a team who's fatigued. You don't have to have watched much footy to see players tired. And if you don't get turnovers, when you're not swarming, I mean, we get the turnovers because multiple players create pressure. We win that contest. We then create a one-on-one further up the field. Sorry, a one-on-one or outnumber further up the field. That's the whole model. And that swarm, that pressure we put on them. If you're fatigued, you're just not simply able to put that same level of pressure on them. I mean, what's interesting a bit with a turnover number that's a bit of an anomaly is that we had as many as them. We just didn't score from them. And again, though, that suggests to me is that they did a better job of putting us under pressure when they won the turnover. And we weren't able to capitalise because we weren't putting them under the same amount of pressure. We had less players at the ball.
So this fatigue, does this have, you talk about the loading, and this is what we may as well go to you now in terms of the loading. Do you want to sort of explain that to either new listeners or to myself who still doesn't understand it after a whole season of you trying to explain it to me?
Well, I'll keep it to, this is a theory, so I will preface it by the fact that this is my theory. Those symptoms that I talked about. So in the last 2 weeks, for the second sake, this is the key point. So I talked about this year, last year. All of these things were discussed on the podcast last year and all over Demon Land last year, exactly this point. For that reason, I think I have no confidence that we won't struggle this weekend for these reasons. So in the last couple of the weeks, we've been had lots of uncharacteristic fumbles, lots of poor decision making. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the opposition are able to move the ball quickly through the corridor. We've got trouble all of a sudden shutting down our switches, or the opposition switches, I should say, and therefore trouble, real difficulty and challenges stopping the opposition transitioning out of our front half into their up the ground. Clearly fatigued players. Gawn was exhausted 20 minutes into that quarter. We've got less swarm, less multiple players running in waves, less players hitting the contest. Because of that, as I mentioned before, we've got an inability to create goals with swarm and run. one of the most noticeable things that's happened in the last couple of weeks is the opposition of just marking way too many one-on-ones in the forward half. That's because they're moving the ball. Both Freo and Swans were moving the ball so quickly. We weren't able to get back with our defensive zone, and they were killing us in the air. And we've also sort of related to that, uncharacteristically giving up a lot of contested marks, which, all of those things aren't normal for the way we play now. Why? What's happening? What's causing those issues? Now, you could, there's a lot of factors. There's the COVID issue we had against Freo. The talk was, in the last couple of weeks, I've heard that, there were up to 6, 7, 8 players with the flu in that game, not just Petrarca. So there's that. There's some recovery. We've got not our best players on the field. We've got injuries. So all of those factors, long season, they all play a part. But I apply the Occam's razor principle, which is often the answer is the simplest one. And for me, the simple answer is we're fatigued through loading. Loading has been part of football forever and a day. It's one of the strangest phenomena in football. It's standard footy practice. And as I put on Demonland, you could write a thesis on why it is that people want to completely ignore it. And the thesis would have a chapter on why current players and coaches reflexively deny loading happens. It seems to be, the greatest evil is to offer up any reason for poor performance, lest it be accused, you'd be accused of, the greatest sin of all, which is to make excuses. It's for the same reason that people don't factor how important injuries are, because you don't make excuses. That's the culture of footy. But the loading thing is bizarre because the evidence is there. You can see it. Can it be a coincidence that exactly at this same point in the year, all of those issues that I listed were happening? No, it can't. As you mentioned at the top, Richmond in each of their premiership years lost multiple games. At what point in the season? At this point in the season. Same with West Coast in their 2018 win. They lost 3 or something. They were the dominant team, and they lost a handful of games in the middle part of the year. Famously, the Cats struggle to win after bye. No one's ever asked why. Why is it? They think, is this some random event? For years, they struggled to win after the bye. It's no doubt because they were loading. Now, I'd argue that all teams load, but some load in a different way, because you're planning to get to it's like an athlete who is a top shelf 800 metre runner, as I was thinking, like Peter Boll. If he was to have an Olympic final on the last day in September, but also is competing in the European athletics that started end of March, so the same period as our footy season, he wants to be cherry ripe on day one of his season at the end of March. So he's going to have a big pre-season. He also wants to be cherry ripe for the 800 metre final. So he's going to have to stop running at some point and load up. And take a block of where he's not running and get ready for that. It's no different for us. We run in AFL footy. Players run between 10 to 15, sometimes more kilometres per match for 6 months. Aerobically, it is an incredibly taxing game. Some teams, if you know that you're in a top 4 contention, well, you'll load up differently. You can risk losing a game against Collingwood like we did last year. If you're at Collingwood and you're on the bubble of making the finals, you can't do that, and nor can the Swans. You don't have the luxury of being able to risk a loss that you might otherwise get. And equally, some teams will be impacted more by fatigue. So Melbourne and Richmond, for instance, both game plans are built on that all-team running that I mentioned before. If you take that out of our game, we go way back to the pack. That's what we've seen last 2 weeks. We suddenly look like an ordinary top 8 team when you take that in. But when you add that back in, then suddenly we get what we got from round 17 last year. So it's really important to remember we got beaten by the Dogs in round 17 last year, coming off a draw to Hawks. We didn't get going till round 18. And then we've absolutely pulverised the Suns. And if you remember that game, suddenly it looked like, it was like a whole different team. We were completely fresh. We were running over the ground, and we swarmed them in that game. And we never looked back. From that point on to the end of the grand final, we averaged 107 points a game. And it was built on that all-team defensive running and swarm, which we just can't do at the moment. And so there's no question in my mind that the reason for that is the loading. And as I said, all teams do it to some degree or other. The top 4 contenders will do it probably to a much higher level at a much more demanding level. It's going to impact Lions less because they rely less on that all-team defensive running. One of the comments on Demonland, so it's created a bit of argument and discussion on Demonland. And there's two things that come out. Well, why wouldn't we know about it? If it happens, why wouldn't we know about it? One, it's the culture thing. You just don't do it. Who knows? Australian rules footy, the way it's covered, is bizarre, I reckon. But you might remember when we had this discussion last year, this very exact same discussion, Rewald was basically admitted it on 360. He was asked directly by Waitley, do you load? And he was talking about, I forget which season he was talking about. He said, yes, essentially. So, there's just no doubt it happens. The other factor is, so why would it happen? I think that's obviously a key why we don't know about it. And then, that's the other thing about, well, what are the reasons for? Why does this happen at this point of time? So for me, it's a huge factor. I think we'll struggle. Against Collingwood, it won't be such a big issue because they don't move the ball as incisively as Freo and the Swans do. So that's what caught us out because you can't spread. Collingwood play a much more aggressive territory game where it's contest, and so they won't exploit us in the same way. So I reckon it'll be a really close physical game, which will really help us at this point of season. We've also got all those other issues that we talked about that are exacerbating things. So I think head up, this is what happens every year. I've said at the beginning of the season, this is what we'd be talking about it. We are talking about it. I find it funny that there's this collective refusal to acknowledge it. I don't really understand what that's about. So that's my take, and that's my 2 cents on loading. And the positive thing about it, from my perspective, is agree or disagree, I'm pretty confident that I'm right, and it means that I'm not too stressed about getting beaten by Freo. One of the other things that, or Swans, and one of the other comments about, well, if the two pushbacks against the discussion about loading is, well, why don't we know about it? So I've answered that. The other one is, well, why doesn't it happen to other teams? And I think fans often just are so insular that they look at their own team. Brisbane have now lost 2 of their last 3 games. The one that they won was against the Suns. The Giants. They were 30 points down after 20 minutes of footy in that game. They looked flat against Freo. Now, who's talking about them? They had a chance to go to the top of the ladder if they rolled Freo. They've lost 2 of the last 3. They play Saints this week. If they lose that, they will have lost 3 of the last 4. Freo lost 2 of their games coming into our game. So after they beat us, they'd also lost 2 of their 3. That's the top 3 teams have lost 2 of their last handful of games in close succession. As I said, you talked about the examples in other seasons, but to me, that's pretty compelling evidence. And, it's just, as I say, it's what happens in footy.
So what you're saying is we're going to lose this week?
I am not confident. If you're a punter, back Collingwood at the line would be my tip. So I think there's every chance we'll lose this week. Yeah.
Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week. George, anything you want to add to that before you go into your improvement?
How could I possibly add anything to that? As Lazy in the chat room said, he wants Binman to put it on a PhD and we can read about it later on.
You get working on your thesis, Binman.
Yeah. I spend too long writing on Demonland to do. What I might just do is pull together my Demonland.
Cut and paste. Cut and paste.
I'll get my 100,000 words pretty quickly.
Well, I'll take a cut of whatever you make from that. George, you want to go into your improvement, A and B, and the strange tactics?
Yeah, strange statistics rather than tactics.
Sorry.
We all know about A and B and his running and pressure and things like that. What I was concerned when I was looking through the statistics is his actual football output this week. He had 20 disposals, 8 kicks and 12 handballs, and the grand total of 108 metres gained. Now, given he kicked for goal from about 40 metres, that means his total metres coverage was about 60 to 70 metres for the whole game off the other 19%, off the other 19 disposals. Now, as an example, Ben Brown with four disposals had 92 metres covered. So the question is, what in the hell's A and B doing with the ball in hand when he's got it in hand? He's just not using it to get any territory. I don't know that he's using it all that well. So just keeping an eye on it. We all know about his running capabilities, but I think if this is going to continue, then Toby Bedford, who can run equally as well, may well find himself replacing someone else.
I think what's also been disappointing is he's had, and I'm just trying to look up what he's had shots at goal in the last couple of weeks at crucial times and has missed, which has been very disappointing. Just trying to find. No, that goes back to his first season. He's kicked in the last 2 weeks 2 points. Yeah,
I wouldn't be greatly worried about that. I mean, if Bean Man's theory about loading is correct, if you're kicking from 40 or 50, as was the case on the weekend, then you haven't got the same depth of kicking capabilities. But 108 metres off 19 possessions when he's playing almost a outside mid type of role isn't very much at all. So my question is about his contribution with ball in hand as opposed to his other things, which are very critical to the side.
No, but I've always said if you're going to have low stats and low percentage gain, you've got to make the most of opportunities. And when you're in front of goal and you miss 2 crucial goals, particularly in games where it's the Freo game wasn't too close in the end, but all right. B-Man, you want to add anything to that, or we'll move on?
From any of my answers from now on for the next 4 weeks is going to be loading.
All right, loading. There you go.
Just with that, some players will. It'll be really. I mean, who knows the impact of the second season of this? But I wonder whether at this point in last season, Jackson super struggled. We were talking about it on the podcast. His contribution dropped off the shelf. But a player like Nibbler, whose game is built around the clicks that he runs, and same for Langdon. He was the player in that Giants game. It was so noticeable how less his ability to run over the ground last year, and I wonder whether that's at least partly a factor in terms of Nibbler. But the other thing is that it looked a bit like we were trying to control the ball by not, we weren't swarming. We don't have that energy. And so it looked a bit like we were trying to sort of hold back the dam a little bit. And so whether Nibbler is doing a bit more of sort of chipping it around the back line when he gets at George, I'm not sure. I'd have to look where he got his kick. But yeah, it's an interesting observation. He's not going anywhere, George. I can guarantee you that.
Last time you said that he was out for a week.
Nibbler?
When he caught COVID.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, he came straight back in.
Yep.
You realise we're going to be playing Brisbane in a couple of weeks. So what happens when 2 teams are loading at the same time? Does that cancel each other out?
I was wondering about that. And I wonder whether, look, we should get a sports scientist on because I'm clearly not a sports scientist. But I did wonder, one of the other comments is, you wouldn't be loading at this point of the year. But you'd be loading closer to the finals. But that's not how it works. You've got to taper. You've got to taper for a long period of time. So you've got to be super as fresh as possible. And what's interesting about our season as opposed to last season is that we've got a really tough last 6 weeks. So we played Brisbane a second time in that. And so I wonder whether, whether Freo, for instance, I know it was wet and difficult conditions, but they lost those 2 games against 2 teams outside the 8. Maybe, they were loading at that time to be as fresh as possible for their 2 big games against us and the Lions. And I backed the Freo on my theory and did pretty well out of it on the weekend because I couldn't believe Lions were favourite for that game. It was mind-boggling because Freo, 1, were in better form. They just rolled us for a start. And 2, Brisbane had come off poor form. But yeah, so it's an interesting question on that timings. I suspect... it's an interesting question about when 2 teams are loading. I don't have an answer for that one.
All right, let's move on to Casey. I wasn't able to get to the G early enough to watch the 2s. George, you did get to see Casey run out on the G, which I hope they will schedule more of these matches in the future. Who of the Demon listed players impressed you?
I didn't quite get to see them run out. I actually watched the first quarter on the telly and then caught the game and caught the second half, which was interesting because it absolutely confirmed my and Binman's observations about the difference between watching a game in telly and live. Things and players that you thought were doing quite all right on the telly, I can tell you, weren't all doing all that right. When you see them live, but anyhow, look, it was pretty obvious. Rivers and Hibbert were simply a class above everyone else there. I wouldn't be surprised to see either of those come in this week. Hopefully, Rivers' knee is a bit better than the strapping that he puts on it every week, which is just huge. Hibbert played a full game as far as I saw. Whereas last week he had limited minutes, but he was certainly Hibbert of old, just reliable down the back. And this was in the absence of Tomlinson in the side. The one who does look really good is Turner, Disco Turner as they call him. He reads the play beautifully down in the back line. He has got every characteristic that Harry Petty has got in the capabilities, reads the football, natural footballer, can kick and mark and do just absolutely everything. JVR didn't do very much. He contributed this week, but it's typical of a 19-year-old, and we keep forgetting that. He has a great week one week, kicks 6 goals, and the next week he doesn't score anything. And that's why you wouldn't want to be pushing him through to the seniors as yet. He certainly knows what to do, and he absolutely crashed a pack in a huge way that resulted in a goal out the back to one of our players. But, he's well and truly development. Rosman apparently did a hamstring before during training, so he didn't play this week. Bailey Laurie is good, but my question about Bailey Laurie is how in the hell does he get a run in the seniors ever? He's being played in the midfield. He's a long way behind, the Olivers, Petrarcas, Vineys, Harms. Even when you go further than that, Chandler's, how does the guy get a run? I don't know.
Maybe as a tall forward.
Well,
yes, we might have a hole there, which is interesting.
He has re-signed for another 2 years, so he's obviously wants to stick around and not be sort of traded to a team.
He's certainly got the capabilities, but it's just such the talent ahead of him is his biggest problem. Oscar Baker, as somebody said on the weekend, he'd have 60 or 80 games in most other AFL clubs, but
he's just not good enough kick, is he?
He's just an awful kick. He gets the ball so much. He runs. He's very fast. Runs brilliantly. But I can't remember. Someone on Demonland said, "Yeah, he'd be great, but he can't hit the side of a barn with his kicking, and that just doesn't work in AFL anymore. So, particularly if you're playing on the wing, you've got to be able to deliver." I was disappointed watching Majak live as opposed to Majak on the TV. On the TV, he looks fantastic. He's always at the ruck contest. He gets the he's very athletic. Gets the ball around, gets the ball down. Doesn't do very much work other than that. That's his problem. He really is a break glass in case of emergency, and it's only as a rucking option. But if you want to get to AFL level as a ruck, you've got to do a lot more work around the ground and a lot more running. And like I said, live, didn't see a great deal of evidence of that. So, good thing about Casey is they haven't lost a game. They're looking pretty threatening. They'll certainly be in it. It was interesting to watch. It was great to see it before the game. Before the main game gave the people something to watch, and it's much more entertaining than all those stupid music and flashing light stuff that the AFL think that they're contributing to the fan experience by. Just put some reserve games on and that'll be a far greater experience.
How did Melksham play?
Honestly, I did not notice him. Honestly, did not notice him. Sorry.
And Rivers, how was he running across the ground? He
seemed to be moving quite freely. He was certainly involved. And the unfortunate thing is when players of that quality, and Hibbert's the same, when they go back to the VFL, they do stand out because they just do things so easily. It's so I don't know whether he's being pressured to the same amount.
Yeah.
Probably not at that level, particularly in the back line. Sydney sort of fell away heavily in the second half. They did well in the second quarter and came back a little bit, but after that it was a one-way street. So the black backs didn't need to do a lot more. So, but he looked well enough to come back.
I reckon Petty's a really good analogy or comparison to Turner. You're right. Like they're similarly not really huge, so not like May's size, that sort of key defender, but both read the ball super well. But yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. Both are, well, obviously Petty is, that we know from just his body of work at AFL level, but Turner is a natural footballer, isn't he? He gets where the ball is going to go. He's smart in his use. He doesn't try too much. He's a bit of a wild card, I reckon, as we head towards the finals, because I'd hate to see. I don't want to see Petty go up forward. There's been some discussion on Demonlanders whether maybe Petty could go up forward, and it's like you've got such a good defender, that's where you keep him. So, but I wonder whether Turner's got the smarts to go up forward. I mean, he's not really big enough, is he?
Probably not. No. And again, he's young and he was injured at the start of the season.
Well, he's 22 or something. Wasn't he mature age?
I can't remember. Sorry.
Yeah, I think we drafted him. Didn't we get him
right.
in the mid-season draft?
Yeah, I think it might be. Yeah. But yeah, let's hope that he's not a replacement for Petty this week.
No, yeah.
Talking about replacements, we may as well get into the ins and outs. And without knowing what damage from this week's match is, it's hard to sort of make predictions. Surely Stephen May is a lock to come back in. As we said, we don't know if Petty's shoulder, there's anything more to come of that. And if he doesn't come up, then Tomlinson, I guess, will stay in, or if Petty does get up, then Tomlinson will be probably out of the team in the LIFO system, last in, first out. And then come forward line, they might move around some deck chairs on the Titanic and bring Wiedemann to replace Mitch Brown. But I just don't know. I don't know if there'll be any other changes. Guys, what do you think, big man?
Well, we 100% know that Wiedemann's not coming back in.
Well, not after that comment, no.
No. And so you'd reckon Mitch Brown will stay in. He wasn't super impressive, but he...
Thought he was good early on in the game. He took a couple of marks, but after that, neither him nor Ben Brown were taking any marks up the line.
Yeah.
Obviously, down forward, they weren't.
Yeah. So, look, in terms of... So, we know Tommy Max...
Well, he's not coming
situation. He's not coming back in. It would... would they take Rivers out for a week and only give him a week and bring him back? I mean, they've done that before. Personally, I'd like to see a fit and firing Rivers back in, and then Brayshaw back to the wing. Where that leaves JJ, I'm not sure. So
JJ's been pretty good. I know we haven't mentioned
fantastic, but yeah, I mean, you want a fit and firing Rivers back in that team. I mean, he's obviously sort of gone back to work on some things. Hunt didn't have a great game, did he?
He was pretty ordinary. Three disposals.
Yeah, and they again with the Swans and Freo both did something really clever, and it was again linking to our inability to spread properly. It just won't happen when we're spreading properly, the amount of one-on-ones. But both Freo and Swans did really, really cleverly isolated particular players up forward. And or down back for us, and one of them was Hunt. They really looked to isolate him one-on-one, and that effort where I forget who he jumped over, or it was
Papley.
Of all players to be sitting underneath it is Papley, and Hunt was looking at the umpire. I was thinking, honey, don't look at the umpire, mate. Just find a hole and jump into it, because it was terrible, and it was a really critical time of the game. And the other funny thing about how we're playing at the moment, and fatigue, I think fatigue makes everything more difficult, but also the decision maker, they're looking a little bit flummoxed at times, which that we don't see that often. And Hunt looked a bit flummoxed when he gets trapped one-on-one, but yeah, I think that he's probably got some credits in the bank because he's done well. I mean, they've got some good small forwards. We'll talk about it in a sec, the Pies. So it'll be really interesting to see. I don't think he'll get dropped on the one game. Brown, if my theory is correct, some players will be impacted more by the loading, and Brown's one of them. So he struggles to get to contest, but he's had some disastrously low numbers in the last couple of weeks, hasn't he? But he's not going to get dropped either. So we
haven't got a forward, but I can't see Hunt staying in the side at the moment. The fact that the opposition coaches have targeted him tells you something. And if Hibbert's half capable, I think he would do the job.
And how was he moving quick enough to play on Cameron, you reckon, George, from what you saw?
Well, like I said, it was hard to say because the Swans fell away so dramatically. But Hibbert's greatest asset probably is his strength, firstly, and also his ability to kick the ball. Again, the in case of emergency, kick the ball out of the back line 60 metres. He can do that so brilliantly at times. So,
and he's a natural defender, isn't he? I mean, Hunt for all his, like that. He's not a natural one-on-one defender, that's for sure. And Hibbert he loves one-on-one, and that's his strength really, because he can play on someone much bigger than him and much stronger than him, and equip himself pretty well. So I'm glad to hear that he's in good nick, because we could probably do with a bit of his ability to hit packs hard and his aggression as well, I reckon, just about now.
Well, let's move on to opposition watch. Big man, you watched the Magpies. They got out to an early lead of 30-odd points, only for the Hawks to mount a spirited comeback. Magpies were victorious in the end by 4 points in a thriller. What can we expect from our opposition this week?
They're everyone's darlings this year, aren't they, the Pies? Like other people, I've really enjoyed watching them play, and it's just interesting the different approach that they've taken to the game after the Buckley years, I guess. And Buckley was so defense first, and under McRae, his presses are fantastic. He doesn't. He's honest and open and enthusiastic. Him and Mitchell, I've been loving both of them, actually. Sam Mitchell. Their model is really interesting in what they've changed. I mean, in some respects, it's a little similar to the Melbourne example, with Roos coming in and being, really focused on a defence and limiting opposition scores. As basically that was it. Buckley did that for 5, 6, 7 seasons, and so if you're a Collingwood fan, it must be a breath of fresh air this year. And McRae is in similar to, say, the 2018, 2017 Melbourne team, looking to get the ball forward, not as defensively strong, but really, really excellent in the contest. They've got a really simple game plan. I haven't quite got a handle on their sort of defensive structures or setup. It's not super sophisticated, not that strong. That's their sort of weakness, I think, isn't it, George?
Yeah, It really falls down to Moore and Howe.
Yeah.
And they drop their ruckman back.
Yeah, and with Moore and Howe, if you can stretch him and he's good one-on-one, but he got towed up a couple of weeks ago when they did get some separation and quick ball movement. I mean, quick ball movement will expose every backline. There's no, and put every backline under pressure. Normally we can cover it, but you can't when you're down. When you're not putting pressure on that last kick inside 50, as we talked about in 2019 and 20 a lot. If that pressure's not been kicked, well, any defender's going to struggle. The thing that really marks the Pies out this year is their contest and their territory. They've got the way they look is like Richmond's game plan without the defensive system behind the ball, which is get it forward at all costs and then back yourself to win that post clearance possession, which is, for weeks was everyone was talking about in the commentary. Now they haven't been, but that's by all accounts almost the most important statistic for coaches in footy, and they're terrific at it. And so they look to get it forward, much similar to us, without that sort of defensive system behind to protect. So they're vulnerable on the absolutely vulnerable on the turnover. But they've got their forward line sort of Ginnivan, and I really rate Oliver Henry. He's got a good pair of hands and floats across the pack and takes those sort of Royce Hart type marks. I'm not comparing him to Royce Hart, but that same style. They've got a reasonable in Pendlebury and Crisp and Cameron. They've got this sort of a decent following brigade. De Goey's a wild card up forward. They fight super hard, really, really hard to trap it in there. Once they do, really it's not much science to their game plan. It's really about the contest, which is why I think they're a good team for us to be playing. Because, as I said, I'm convinced that we've been we're fatigued. Really doesn't matter what the reason is. The fatigue's obvious. I don't think anyone can argue with that. And they're not a team that's going to expose that so badly for us, because they don't move the ball through the corridor. They look to go through the corridor, but they're not as incisive as the Swans and Freo. Certainly not Freo. Freo were brilliant against the Lions. I really enjoy watching them play, but they're so quick on the outside. Collingwood will just run through us, which will suit us because they won't expose us on the spread as much, and so therefore it'll mitigate against our all-team defensive running being sort of 10% off where it needs to be, or where it will be come finals. I think what's the small forward that
Ginnivan?
No, not Ginnivan. The
Elliot.
Is he injured? Did he got?
Yeah, he's out at the last minute.
Yeah, and he's. I can't recall what his injury is, but he's critical to them, and he's exactly the sort of player that throws up a problem for us. And if he does play, Hibbert is the sort of player who could take him. Whereas I reckon Hunt would really struggle on him. Ginnivan, is the sort of player that you probably don't have a direct opponent on, and you just back your defenders to win the ground ball down there against him. But Elliot is a player that has always troubled us, and I would be happy enough if he doesn't play. I think that we can expect a very sort of tough arm wrestle for the whole day, probably very similar to that game that on the weekend with a bit less flair. But I'm probably overselling Swans' flair a little bit. They were really meat and potatoes. They had tackled hard. I think Collingwood tackles number will be high again. It probably sets up really well too, given that the big freeze was up in Sydney last year, and it was a bit of a weird sort of feel to that game. It's good that it's back at the G for the first time in is this the first time in 3 years we've had the big freeze Queen's birthday? So, a team Collingwood in the 8 against us, there'll be a big crowd, you'd hope, and it's our home game, isn't it? I'm hoping.
No, it's not.
Oh, no, that's terrible. Well, there you go. It'll be a big crowd for their grand final.
They've got a pretty impressive midfield at the moment, mainly because they're so damn tough as those players. It'll be an interesting contest. That Maynard, Crisp, Adams, De Goey was playing a fair bit in the middle as well this week. Pendlebury they bring in as a sweeper almost out the back of the mids, but they've got a really solid mid group. But yeah, you're right. They love playing through the middle. But it's all run and gun. So if they turn it over, it's absolutely lethal down the other end. So hopefully we've got, we'll have Stephen May back this week and get that structure back. Lever can start intercepting again. But that's the way to expose them. It was interesting. They led by 30 points against Hawthorn, and then they ran out of legs. That was the other thing. It's all run and gun.
It's all run and gun, contest after contest. Yeah. They're in the first. No, they're not really in the first year of a rebuild, are they? They've been there and thereabouts. But, it's interesting philosophically because even as a non-Pies fan, I enjoy watching them more now than under Buckley. And you've got to,
Yeah.
you know,
It's great. It's great to watch. Great
Yeah.
to watch Dacos. With 35 possessions last week for someone so young to be racking up those sort of numbers. But
Yeah.
brilliant young players all around the ground. You hate to say it, but they're heading in the right direction.
Yeah, and it was a super game because Mitchell's taken the same philosophy. And that's good because both coaches have clearly said, well, we're here for the experience. If we get the 8 and, make it out, find their way in the 8, well, that's fantastic, isn't it? But their focus is on this is the way we want to play. Let's play, and we can risk losing games that, they were really lucky to win that game. But again, it's their defensive weakness. If we've talked about it as well, it's that risk reward. If you go through the corridor and turn it over, you're going to be in trouble. And they do turn it over a lot, as will the Swans once, they hit the bit against teams who can pressure them better than we did in the centre.
Question on everybody's lips is, will Max Gawn finally get a bounce? I don't know if you saw this statistic today that Max Gawn has played the most games by current players without a bounce. 171 games without bouncing the ball. Do you trust Max to bounce the ball?
We taught him how to kick.
Yeah, I was going to say that one massive improvement per season. So he can kick now. Next season, he'll work on his bouncing.
Yeah, I want to see him bound through the middle, take a bounce, kick a big goal.
He'll have to go to the Ed Langdon school for a while there, I think.
On just one last thing on the game that we played in the week is, again, whatever the reason is, Petrarca is not himself in terms of explosive power, is he? He's just not. He's not powering away from the contest. He's blowing up pretty quick. He's whether he's still recovering from the flu. It's a lot of people have been knocked around pretty hard by it. So, there's probably a few players in that team who've struggled with the flu and getting back up the following week.
Yeah, I heard, I won't mention any names, but I heard one of the players who did have COVID struggled the next week breathing. So I wouldn't be surprised. And apparently the flu that's going around is a lot worse than COVID has been to a lot of people. So I wouldn't be surprised if Track is still suffering from the bout of flu that he probably had the other week. George, since we've got a little bit of time up our sleeves, you said you wanted to mention the AFLW. Yeah,
just for people who haven't been following it, the trade and draft period has just been on. I'm not sure if it's finished, actually. It might have finished today. It's once again very obvious that we're looking towards playing at the serious end of the finals. We're not worried about the draft. We had an appalling draft situation this year in any case because we played in the grand final. So that means you're instantly down at the bottom of the picks, and then there's 4 teams have come in and they've all been given priority picks ahead of us. So I think off the top of my head, I think our first pick was originally going to be somewhere in the 20s. But when you bring in the requirement that the AFLW has of selecting players from their home states, our pick was possibly going to be more like in the 40s. So what's the point of going to the draft almost this year? And that's why in previous years we've picked up and traded to get high draft picks before this came in. So we picked up a couple of great players for the looks of it. Jordan Ivey from Geelong, who was actually Geelong's vice captain, 29 years of age and a defender, and that's a great addition to the side. And also Charlotte Wilson from Carlton, a 21-year-old defender again. And we've traded a few picks to pick up those players. But really, we've still got to pick somewhere around the 40s, 50s mark. So we really haven't lost a great deal, but we've added a couple of players. The other thing that people may not have understood is the AFL, in their wisdom, required every team to amass 28 points of player worth, whatever that is, to be by trading off players to the new incoming expansion sides. And if you didn't get 28 points, to this day, nobody knows what the formula is. It was based around age and pay scales and things like that. If you didn't get the 28 points, which we didn't and Adelaide didn't, you lost your first draft pick.
Jeez.
In any case. So what was the point for us and Adelaide going to the draft this year? You just went straight out and tried to get other players. So that's exactly what we've done. We picked up a couple of good ones on it seems. And if you look on the Demonland side and also the Melbourne Footy Club side, there's a few highlights which all look very promising, but I've never seen bad highlights yet about any players.
I have fantastic highlights. It only goes for about 10 seconds, but they were fantastic. Look, I don't know too much about the new teams coming into the AFLW, but I would suspect that the talent pool is going to be spread very thin, and I hope it doesn't get into and I'm sure it will, there'll be some teams that get absolutely thrashed, and I'm pretty sure not every team's going to be playing every team once. Is that going to, so there's going to be a bit of a, lopsided draw, I'm sure, and we'll get screwed once again.
Yeah, as happened a couple of years ago when I think it was Carlton got into the finals and having one less games than what we had, something ridiculous. So,
have they announced when they're starting? How many rounds?
August, but not 10 rounds.
Yeah, it's only 10 rounds.
Yeah, and August, but not a starting date or the actual draw.
Oh, they don't know when it finishes either.
Yeah.
When
I think they know when it finishes because they've got a starting date, haven't they? It's like the first round; they haven't announced anything else. So 10 rounds and 4-week finals.
Yeah, I don't know about the dates, but you're right, Andy. The talent pool will be spread very thinly. The good thing is that the drafting over the last couple of years has, for the first time, been for girls who have actually played their whole life effectively. As in women's competition, as opposed to people like Daisy who were playing bits and pieces here and there. So the talent will come through. It's just
will.
They're all 17 at the moment.
Yeah.
Those girls. So it'll take a couple of years. But I think we'll see some pretty awful matches, unfortunately.
Just one final comment, Andy, about loading. I was trying to find this before. Watson 11 posted this today on Demonland, and a shout out to Watson 11. He's been posting some great stats and some great analysis in the tactics thread. I think he or she or they, I'm not sure, because they agree with me, I think he's really clever. So he posted today that our fourth quarter stats support the loading theory. In last year, in the rounds 11 to 18 last year, in that period that I was talking about that we'd struggled, we were 3 wins, 5 losses in fourth quarters. But for the rest of the seasons, we were 14 wins, 3 losses in the fourth quarters for the rest of the season. And those losses were 1 point, 4 points, and 6 points. This year, we're 7 wins, 3 losses in the fourth. We were in the fourth quarters for weeks 1 to 10. And so far, we're 0-2 for this quote unquote loading period. We've not looked as fit as last year. He made that point. So we probably need the loading period even more. It makes a point, which is a good one, that the concern is it's a lot tougher draw that we've got moving forward, and our pressure's been down from week 1, so we've got a fair bit to do. But the other thing is he also made the point that some teams will load more than others depending on where they are. But the last second halves have been noticeable, haven't they? Like, running out of gas in the second half has been the feature of both the last 2 weeks, or particularly the last quarter. And just the other comment, there was one of the more curious threads on Demonland this week about the Demon Army and how they rate as a cheer squad compared to other teams. And I wanted to give a shout out to the Demon Army for all of their great work they do. And thanks, Andy, I went to the Best and Fairest last year, which was terrific. And the warmth from the club to the Demon Army was really impressive. I thought they were clearly, the club see them as a big part of the club and important to the club.
Yeah, there was a threat on Demonland. Someone, look, I don't think their intention was to
No, I'm not knocking that.
accuse.
That's okay. God, there's all sorts of crazy things put on Demonland.
No, but it sort of came off against that way. But I think what it comes down to, I think it was more probably it comes down to a criticism, because I don't think you can blame that one section of the crowd. It did sound like when the Swans sort of got going, it did sound that they were louder than perhaps our crowd, which isn't, and Freo as well. I was actually surprised. Freo did actually sound louder than us, but I'm not sure I think when you're sitting in a section of crowd, and everyone around me pretty much Demons, so I think when you're cheering and you're amongst that crowd that's cheering, it doesn't sound as loud acoustically as when the sound's coming from the other side of the ground, i.e. the opposition, when they kick a goal. So I think it just might be acoustics.
And of course, our cheer squad, the Demon Army, have to deal with battling all the members hitting their cheese boards together. I mean, that makes a big noise.
But look, crowds are obviously down across the AFL. There's criticism of I don't know why the D's cop it, because you have a look at some of the other games and it's just as bad, but we seem to cop it, maybe because of our success, and I think that we should be having 50 or 60,000 people there. But look, we've got 60,000 members, and that's a good thing, as long as
63, isn't it? I think I'd read.
If we can retain that next year, that's great. But you need to have success and sustain success, because if we drop off, the membership's going to drop off.
And then we'll have an analysis by George about the finances. So I'm looking forward to that in the mid-season review, actually, George, the numbers. I want the numbers crunched.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting thing. We'll discuss this privately of what we're going to do, but I'm sure we'll do in the bye week after the Collingwood one. We'll do a wrap up of the year so far.
And maybe we could ask the club, where's our club rooms and social club at? That's a perennial mid-season question.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you, Bin Man. Thank you, George. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back next week to hopefully discuss, and I said this last week, to discuss a return to the winners list. But according to Bin Man, that won't be happening. So we'll be discussing maybe another loss.
Well, I predict a tough game. Get on the Pies at the line.
You heard it here first. B-Man is no
Then
longer a Demon
you
supporter.
get the money from the bet and Melbourne win, and you get both, the best of both worlds.
Does that really soothe the pain?
Yeah. Well, not if we win, there's no pain, and you get a bit of money in your kicker. Because the line will be 15 points or something.
Would you rather lose and pay the rent or win and...
Well, I'm not back in Collingwood. I'm back anyway.
We'll be back next week. Go D's.
Go Redlegs.
Come on, Demons. Come on, Demons.